$75,000 in fines, a threatened property lien, and a tow truck aggressively revving its diesel engine right outside my living room window. That was the steep price for building a custom tiny home. But this neighborhood committee forgot one crucial detail. They had absolutely zero legal jurisdiction. My Uncle Henry was a quiet man who kept to himself, tending to his sprawling garden at the very back of his property in the Shady Oaks subdivision. When he passed away, he left the split-level house and the unusually deep, pie-shaped lot to me. Moving into the neighborhood felt like a fresh start. The community was supposedly a peaceful, well-manicured enclave nestled against a dense tree line that separated the residential area from a stretch of wild county forest. The main house was fine, but it was far too big for a single guy who worked remotely as a freelance software developer. I had always dreamed of minimizing my footprint, of living in a space completely designed around my specific needs. That's when the idea for the tiny home took root. Instead of selling Uncle Henry's house, I decided I would rent it out to a nice family and build a high-end, custom, tiny house on the very back edge of the property, tucked behind a dense grove of weeping willows where it wouldn't bother a single soul. I poured my heart, soul, and a substantial portion of my savings into this project. We're not talking about a cheap shed from a hardware store. This was a marvel of modern microengineering, built on a heavy-duty, 28-foot trailer chassis. I spent 6 months sourcing custom-milled cedar siding, installing a standing seam metal roof, and fitting high-efficiency solar panels. Inside it featured a functional galley kitchen with butcher block countertops, a sleeping loft with a skylight for stargazing, and a state-of-the-art composting toilet to bypass the need for invasive plumbing permits. It was entirely off-grid capable, beautifully crafted, and almost completely invisible from the street. For the first 2 months, life was perfect. I rented the main house to a lovely couple, the Millers, who were thrilled to have a large backyard. I lived quietly in my sanctuary by the trees, waking up to the sound of birds and the gentle rustle of the willows. Then came Brinley Green. Brinley was the reigning president of the Shady Oaks Property Owners Association. She was a retired real estate agent who patrolled the neighborhood in a pristine white golf cart, armed with a pink-cased iPad and a seemingly endless reservoir of passive-aggressive authority. To Brinley, a blade of grass growing half an inch over the sidewalk was a personal insult. I met her on a crisp Tuesday morning. I was sitting on the small folding deck of my tiny home, sipping coffee, when I heard the unmistakable electric whine of her golf cart bouncing over the lawn. I watched in disbelief as she drove right past the main house, bypassed the Miller's patio, and parked directly in front of my cedar sanctuary. She stepped out, adjusting her designer sunglasses. The overwhelming scent of heavy floral perfume cut through the crisp morning air before she even opened her mouth. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Are you the contractor? I need to speak with the owner of the property immediately." I stood up, resting my mug on the railing. "I'm the owner, Ethan Wells. Uncle Henry was my uncle. Can I help you with something?" Brinley's eyes scanned my home, her expression morphing into a tight, pinched grimace of utter disgust. "Ethan. I see. Well, Ethan, I am Brinley Green, HOA president. And I'm afraid this camper is a blatant violation of community guidelines." "It's not a camper," I corrected gently, trying to keep the peace. "It's a custom-built tiny home, and it's parked entirely on my property, well behind the setback lines. Boy, I checked the county regulations before I brought it in. The county does not dictate the aesthetic standards of Shady Oaks," Brinley snapped, pulling a thick stack of papers from her golf cart. "Section 4. Paragraph B of the Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions clearly states that no temporary structures, mobile homes, trailers, or secondary dwellings may be erected or parked on any lot without written approval from the Architectural Review Committee, which I chair, and I certainly did not approve this eyesore." "It's not an eyesore, it's a beautifully crafted home, and it's completely hidden from the street," I argued, gesturing to the thick barrier of willow trees. You literally had to trespass across my tenant's lawn just to see it. The HOA has an easement for compliance inspections, she stated smugly, though I strongly doubted the legality of her interpretation. She tapped her iPad screen aggressively. You have exactly 48 hours to remove this trailer from the community, Ethan. If it is not gone by Thursday morning, you will be fined $500, and the fines will accrue daily. She didn't wait for a response. She simply spun on her heel, climbed back into her golf cart, and drove away, leaving deep tire tracks in the damp grass. I was stunned. I went inside and immediately pulled out the massive binder of HOA documents I had inherited with the house. I scoured the CC and Rs. Technically, she was right about Section 4, Paragraph B. There was a clause about secondary dwellings. But there was also a grandfather clause and vague wording about permanent structures versus mobile ones. My home was on wheels, technically making it a registered vehicle, not a permanent secondary dwelling. I figured a polite letter explaining the legal distinction and highlighting how it didn't impact the neighborhood's aesthetic would resolve the issue. I was incredibly naive. Thursday morning arrived, and with it, a bright yellow envelope taped aggressively to the side of my tiny home. Notice of violation. Fine assessed, $500. I called the HOA management company. The receptionist sounded terrified to even speak Brindley's name and told me that all appeals had to be made in person at the monthly board meeting. The next meeting wasn't for 3 weeks. By the time the meeting rolled around, my outstanding fines had skyrocketed to $10,500. The 3 weeks leading up to the board meeting were a psychological nightmare. Brindley didn't just fine me. She waged a campaign of petty harassment designed to make me break. It started with the compliance patrols. Twice a day, Brindley and her 2 loyal board members, a retired accountant named Richard and a severely overly tanned woman named Susan, would park their golf carts on the street and peer through the gaps in my trees with actual binoculars. My tenants, the Millers, were incredibly uncomfortable. They had young children who played in the yard, and having 3 seniors glaring through the foliage with optics was deeply unsettling. Then came the subtle sabotage. One morning I woke up to find that the external water hose I used to top off my freshwater tank had been sliced clean in half. A few days later, a mysterious layer of thick, foul-smelling mud was splattered entirely across my low-angle solar panels, cutting my power generation to almost zero. I couldn't prove it was Brindley or her cronies, but the timing was impossible to ignore. I decided to install a couple of discreet, battery-operated trail cameras in the trees. I didn't catch them in the act of vandalism, but I did catch Richard physically stepping over the property line at 2 a.m., taking flash photographs of my home's composting toilet vent pipe. It was maddening. When the night of the board meeting finally arrived, I walked into the Shady Oaks Community Center armed with a thick manila folder. I had printed out county vehicle codes, property setback maps, and a beautifully drafted plea for an architectural variance. The room was packed. Word had spread about the freelancer living in a shack, and Brindley had clearly rallied her troops. When my name was finally called on the agenda, I stood up and walked to the front of the folding tables where the board sat. "Mr. Wells," Brindley said loudly, ensuring her voice echoed off the cheap linoleum floor. "Have you come to provide proof that the illegal trailer has been removed?" "It's a tiny home, Brindley." "And no, I haven't," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. I addressed the rest of the board and the audience. "I understand there are rules regarding secondary structures. However, under state law, my tiny home is classified as a recreational vehicle because it remains on a chassis with wheels. I am legally parking it on my own property. Furthermore, it is completely obscured from public view. It causes no noise, no pollution, and uses no public utilities. I am formally requesting a variance based on the fact that it does not negatively impact the property values or aesthetic of Shady Oaks." Richard leaned into his microphone. "It impacts our property values just knowing it's there. We don't want a trailer park mentality in Shady Oaks. It's milled cedar and solar glass, I shot back, losing a bit of my composure. It costs more per square foot than your house, Richard. A few people in the back gasped. Brinley banged a wooden gavel she had apparently brought from home. Order, she barked. Mr. Wells, your classification argument is irrelevant. Even if it is a vehicle, our bylaws clearly state that recreational vehicles cannot be parked in residential yards for more than 48 hours. Your request for a variance is denied by unanimous vote. She didn't even look at the other board members. They just nodded like obedient bobbleheads. Furthermore, Brinley continued, her eyes gleaming with triumphant malice, because you have shown blatant disregard for this community, the board has authorized an escalation in penalties. Your daily fine is hereby increased to $250. If the balance, which currently stands at $10,500, is not paid in full by the end of the month, the Shady Oaks Property Owners Association will place a lien on the primary residence at 442 Maplewood Drive. We will foreclose on your uncle's house if we have to, Ethan. Remove the trailer. The room went dead silent. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. They were threatening to steal my inheritance, the house I was renting to a family over a tiny home parked in the woods. You can't do that, I whispered. Read the bylaws, Ethan. Brinley smiled, a thin, venomous line. We can, and we will. I left the community center in a daze. Over the next month, the harassment intensified. The fines kept piling up, transforming into an astronomical number. I consulted with a real estate attorney who looked at the CC&Rs and sighed. HOA laws in our state were notoriously powerful. He explained that unless I could prove the HOA was acting with explicit, documented prejudice, which was nearly impossible to prove in court without internal emails, they absolutely had the right to fine me and eventually foreclose on the main house to collect the debt. I was backed into a corner. I stopped sleeping. I lost weight. Every time I heard a vehicle slow down on the street, my heart hammered in my chest. My tenants gave me notice that they would be moving out at the end of their lease. The stress of the HOA constantly hovering around the property had become too much for them. Brinley was winning. She was systematically destroying my life, my finances, and my peace of mind, all because my existence didn't fit neatly into her cookie-cutter vision of the world. The breaking point arrived on a gloomy Tuesday morning, almost exactly 3 months after Brinley had first trespassed on my lawn. The fines had officially crossed the $75,000 mark, a number so absurd it felt fabricated. I was sitting at my laptop, trying to force myself to code, when a deep, rumbling vibration shook the floorboards of my tiny home. I looked out the window and felt all the blood drain from my face. A massive, heavy-duty flatbed tow truck was backing its way over the Millers' lawn, crushing their carefully planted flower beds. Behind the tow truck, leading the charge in her golf cart, was Brinley Green. I threw open the door of my tiny home and sprinted out, waving my arms frantically. Hey, stop, shut off the truck. The tow truck driver, a burly guy in a high-vis vest, hit the brakes and rolled down his window. He looked confused. Brinley drove her golf cart right up to my steps. She was accompanied by Richard and a uniformed private security guard, the HOA occasionally hired for neighborhood events. What the hell is going on here? I yelled, my voice cracking with adrenaline. We are enforcing the neighborhood covenants, Ethan, Brinley said calmly, holding up a clipboard. You have failed to pay your fines. You have failed to remove the unauthorized vehicle. The board has declared this structure an abandoned nuisance. We are having it towed to an impound lot at your expense. It's not abandoned. I'm standing right here. I live in it. Not anymore, she sneered. Hook it up, driver. Don't you dare touch my house, I shouted at the driver. I ran and stood directly between the massive winch of the tow truck and the hitch of my tiny home. If you try to move this, you're going to have to run me over. This is private property. You are trespassing and this is auto theft. The driver put the truck in park and killed the engine. He looked at Brinley, clearly not wanting to be a part of a vehicular manslaughter charge. Lady, you told me this was a simple impound of an abandoned RV. I'm not getting involved in a standoff. Call the cops if you want him moved. Fine, Brinley snapped, pulling out her phone. I'll have you arrested for disturbing the peace. 10 minutes later, 2 local police cruisers pulled up. The officers trudged through the ruined grass, looking utterly exhausted before they even reached us. They listened to Brinley's impassioned speech about HOA bylaws and nuisance vehicles, and then they listened to me explain that this was my primary residence and they were attempting an illegal eviction and theft. The senior officer, a tired-looking man named Ramirez, rubbed his temples. Look, folks, this is a civil dispute. Mrs. Green, I cannot authorize this tow driver to drag a home away while the owner is standing in front of it. That's a massive liability. If you have a lien, you need a court-ordered writ of possession and a sheriff's deputy to enforce an eviction. The bylaws give me the authority, Brinley screeched. The bylaws don't supersede state law regarding evictions and private property, Officer Ramirez said firmly. He pointed to the tow driver. Pack it up. You need to leave. If I have to come back here today, somebody is going to jail for breach of peace. The tow driver happily obliged, backing his massive rig out of the yard. Brinley was livid. Her face was a mottled purple. This isn't over, Ethan. We are filing the lien tomorrow morning. You are going to lose everything. She stormed off, leaving me standing in the mud, shaking uncontrollably. I had won the battle, but the war was heavily stacked against me. I had a few weeks, maybe a month, before the legal paperwork ground me into dust. That night, I sat at my butcher block counter staring blankly at the wall. I needed a miracle. I needed a loophole. I started digging blindly through the original deed documents Uncle Henry had left in a fireproof safe. I was looking for anything, a missed signature, an expired covenant. What I found was a badly faded, hand-drawn property map from the 1970s. Funny. I noticed something strange. The dimensions of the lot on the drawing didn't seem to match the tax maps the HOA used. The rear property line on the HOA maps perfectly followed a straight wooden fence. But on my uncle's old deed map, the property line extended past the fence, dipping into an oddly shaped triangle right at the edge of the creek. It was a sliver of hope, barely a thread. But I pulled at it. I needed a professional. The next morning I called Thomas Gable. Thomas was a legend in local real estate circles, a crusty 60-something land surveyor who had been mapping the county for 40 years. He smelled perpetually of stale black coffee and old blueprints, and he possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of county boundary lines. I begged him to come out on an emergency basis, offering him double his standard rate. He arrived that afternoon in a battered Ford Ranger, pulling out a state-of-the-art Leica total station and GPS equipment. I explained the situation with the HOA, the threats, the fines, and the old map. Thomas adjusted his faded Carhartt jacket and grunted. HOAs, glorified homeowners with God complexes. Let's see what we've got. For the next 2 days, Thomas was a ghost on my property. He pounded wooden stakes into the ground, shot lasers through the trees, and spent hours referencing GPS coordinates on a rugged tablet. On the 3rd day, he didn't come to the house at all. He texted me. At the county clerk's office. Digging into the archives. Found something weird. The suspense was agonizing. I sat in my tiny home, watching the trail camera feeds on my monitor, waiting for Brinley to orchestrate another attack. At 4 p.m. on Friday, Thomas's truck rattled up my driveway. He didn't bother knocking on the main house. He walked straight back to the trees, carrying a massive, rolled-up topographical map under his arm. He looked tired, but there was a distinct, predatory gleam in his eye. I opened the door to the tiny home. Thomas, tell me you found something. He stepped inside, unrolled the massive map across my kitchen counter, and weighed the corners down with a pair of coffee mugs and a stapler. Ethan, Thomas said, his voice thick with suppressed amusement. You aren't going to believe this. He pointed a calloused finger at a thick black line running across the map. This line here, this is the official platted boundary of the Shady Oaks subdivision. It was laid down in 1952. The developers built a fence along this line in 1975 to mark the edge of their jurisdiction. He traced a second line, a faded blue one that deviated from the black line, creating a weird, wedge-shaped gap between the subdivision boundary and Miller's Creek. "What is that?" I asked, leaning in close. "In surveying, we call this a gore," Thomas explained. "It's an accidental gap between two property lines. When the county was originally surveyed back in 1910, they used the creek as the boundary for the forest tract. But creeks move over time. When Shady Oaks was built, the surveyors used an old meridian line instead of the water line. They accidentally left a 20 by 40-foot wedge of dirt right here on the bank that belonged to neither the subdivision nor the national forest." My heart started to beat faster. "Who does it belong to then?" Thomas grinned, revealing a row of coffee-stained teeth. He pulled a yellowed photocopied document from his jacket pocket and slapped it onto the counter. It was essentially unincorporated county land. But in 1985, your Uncle Henry noticed the discrepancy. He liked to garden near the creek, and he didn't want the county ever claiming it. So, he went down to the municipal office, filed a quiet title action, and purchased that specific wedge of dirt directly from the county for about $500. I stared at him, the implications slowly washing over me. "He bought it separately." "Yes," Thomas said, tapping the document. "He attached the deed to his primary parcel, so it would transfer to his heirs, meaning you, but it was never, ever absorbed into the Shady Oaks subdivision map. It is an entirely separate legal parcel of land." I looked at the map, then looked out my window at the trees, and then down at the floorboards beneath my feet. "Thomas," I breathed, my hands actually shaking. "Where exactly is this gore?" Thomas pulled out a red Sharpie and drew a small rectangle inside the wedge-shaped gap on the map. "You're sitting on it," Thomas said, his grin widening into a massive, triumphant smile. "The front tires of your trailer are about 6 inches away from the HOA boundary. Everything behind it, this entire structure, is sitting firmly on unincorporated county land. The Shady Oaks Property Owners Association has absolutely zero legal jurisdiction over this patch of dirt." The relief that washed over me was so intense my knees actually buckled. I grabbed the edge of the counter to steady myself. $75,000 in fines, the threats, the harassment, the attempted theft of my home. All of it had been built on a foundation of absolute territorial ignorance. Brinley Green was about to experience a very rude awakening. My HOA threatened to foreclose on my family home over a custom, tiny house hidden in my backyard. They slapped me with $75,000 in fines and even sent a tow truck to steal it. But their tyrannical president forgot one crucial detail. My home wasn't in their jurisdiction. The Monday after Thomas Gable dropped the bombshell surveyor's map on my kitchen counter, I practically kicked down the door to my attorney's office. I slammed the oversized, certified topographical map and Uncle Henry's original 1985 deed for the quiet title action onto his mahogany desk. David, my real estate lawyer, pushed his glasses up his nose, bewildered by my sudden burst of frantic energy. But as I walked him through the gore, the accidental wedge of unincorporated county land that my tiny home was currently parked on, his eyes widened. He spent the next 3 hours cross-referencing Thomas's survey data with the county clerk's digital archives and the Shady Oaks covenants, conditions, and restrictions. When he finally looked up, he was smiling. It wasn't a polite, professional smile. It was the predatory grin of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. "Ethan," David said, leaning back in his leather chair, "not only is your tiny home entirely outside of the HOA's legal boundaries, but they have been actively fining your primary property for a structure that doesn't exist on their platted land. It's like me fining you because your neighbor painted his house neon pink." "So the fines are void?" I asked, my heart hammering. "Completely fraudulent," David confirmed. "And it gets better. Remember how Brinley Green sent a tow truck onto your property? Remember the aggressive letters? The board members taking photos at 2 in the morning? I nodded. They were trespassing every single time they stepped past that invisible boundary line onto your uncle's wedge of county land. They were trespassing on private property outside their jurisdiction. But here is the real kicker. David leaned forward, tapping a pen against his desk. Did she officially file that lien against the main house yet? I checked my email. She sent a notice on Friday saying the paperwork would be submitted to the county courthouse this morning at 9 a.m. David looked at his watch. It was 1:15 p.m. Excellent. If she actually filed a lien against your property based on fraudulent fines generated from land they do not own, she has just committed slander of title. And in this state, that comes with severe financial penalties. We aren't just going to defend you, Ethan. We are going to make an example out of her. We hatched a plan. David advised me to say absolutely nothing. We would let Brinley believe she held all the cards. We would let her walk right into the final board meeting of the quarter, the meeting where she planned to publicly announce the foreclosure on my uncle's house. And we would spring the trap in front of the entire neighborhood. The tension over the next 2 weeks was excruciating. But it was a different kind of tension. It was the thrill of a hunter waiting in the blind. I ignored all of Brinley's gloating emails. I ignored the official-looking notice of the lane that arrived in the mail. I just sat in my tiny home, sipping coffee on my little folding deck, enjoying the rustling willows that sat safely on unincorporated county soil. Finally, the night of the quarterly board meeting arrived. The Shady Oaks Community Center was packed to the gills. The neighborhood rumor mill had been working overtime. Everyone knew the rebel freelancer was about to lose his inherited home to the HOA. Some looked at me with pity, but most of Brinley's loyalists looked at me with smug satisfaction. David accompanied me, wearing a sharp, charcoal gray suit and carrying a slim, leather briefcase. We sat quietly in the back row. Brinley called the meeting to order, banging her ridiculous wooden gavel. She went through the mundane budget items with excruciating slowness, clearly saving the main event for last. Finally, she cleared her throat, adjusted her designer glasses, and looked directly at me. Now, for the matter of the Wells property at 442 Maplewood Drive, Brinley announced, her voice echoing through the PA system. As you all know, this board has exhausted every avenue to bring Mr. Wells into compliance regarding the illegal, makeshift trailer abandoned in his backyard. Because he has refused to pay the $75,000 in accumulated fines, the HOA has officially secured a lien on his primary residence. Foreclosure proceedings will commence on the 1st of the month. Fosti. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Susan, the overly tanned board member, nodded sympathetically, though she looked thrilled. Richard, the retired accountant, adjusted his microphone. It is unfortunate, but rules are what separate us from animals. I stood up. David stood up next to me. Madame President, David called out, his voice projecting effortlessly across the room without a microphone. I am David Sterling, legal counsel for Mr. Wells. We would like the floor for 3 minutes to present new documentation regarding this property dispute. Brinley scoffed, crossing her arms. You can have 3 minutes, Mr. Sterling, but a lawyer won't save him from the bylaws. The lien is already filed. Yes, we are well aware of the lien, David said, walking calmly down the center aisle. I followed closely behind, holding a massive, rolled-up cardboard tube. In fact, the lien is exactly why we are here. We reached the front folding tables. I uncapped the tube and unrolled Thomas Gable's massive certified topographical map directly over Brinley's carefully organized agenda papers. What is this nonsense? Brinley snapped, trying to push the map away. This nonsense, Mrs. Green, is a state-certified survey of the Shady Oaks boundary lines, cross-referenced with a 1985 deed of quiet title. David explained loudly, ensuring the entire room could hear. He pointed a finger at the thick black line, and then at the faded blue triangle. Your subdivision ends here, David continued, tapping the black line. My client's tiny home is parked here, in this geographical gore. This wedge of land is an entirely separate parcel, purchased from the county by Mr. Wells's uncle 40 years ago. It has never been, and will never be, part of the Shady Oaks Property Owners Association. The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the cheap linoleum floor. Brinley stared at the map, her eyes darting back and forth. A splotchy red flush began to creep up her neck. That is impossible. It's in his backyard. I can see it from the street. Sightlines do not dictate property law, Brinley, David said, his tone turning remarkably icy. My client's secondary home is sitting on unincorporated land. Your HOA has zero jurisdiction over it. Therefore, every single fine you have levied against Mr. Wells is completely fraudulent. Richard grabbed the map, his accountant brain desperately trying to process the boundary coordinates. Wait, if this is accurate, we've been fining him for a structure that isn't even in our neighborhood. Exactly, David smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. And because you filed a lien against his primary residence based on fraudulent, fabricated debts, you have committed slander of title. Furthermore, the repeated, unauthorized entry onto this separate county parcel by members of this board constitutes criminal trespassing. Brinley's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment. Panic flared in her eyes before being quickly replaced by cornered rage. I am the president of this association. I will not be intimidated by a fake map. We have an easement. We have rights. You have a massive lawsuit heading your way, David corrected her, leaning over the table so he was eye level with her. First thing tomorrow morning, we are filing a civil suit against the Shady Oaks Property Owners Association for harassment, trespassing, emotional distress, and slander of title. We will be seeking damages in excess of $200,000. The crowd erupted. Several homeowners jumped to their feet, shouting over one another. $200,000 would bankrupt the HOA's reserve fund. You can't do that, Brinley shrieked over the noise, slamming her gavel down repeatedly, though no one was listening to her anymore. Oh, we can, I finally spoke up, looking her dead in the eye. And we will. You should have just left me alone, Brinley. The fallout was spectacular, swift, and completely devastating for Brinley Green's reign of terror. The morning after the board meeting, David filed our lawsuit at the county courthouse. When the HOA's legal counsel, a frantic corporate attorney from a downtown firm, reviewed Thomas Gable's survey and the 1985 deed, he immediately advised the board to surrender. But Brinley, blinded by her own bruised ego, refused. In a desperate attempt to save face, she secretly authorized the use of $30,000 from the neighborhood's emergency roofing fund to hire a private bulldog litigator to fight our claim. She didn't tell the rest of the board. That was her fatal mistake. The bulldog litigator took one look at the case law, realized Brinley had intentionally filed a fraudulent lien based on territory she didn't own, and immediately dropped her as a client, keeping a hefty retainer for his trouble. Worse, when the HOA's insurance provider found out about the impending slander of title lawsuit, they sent a formal letter denying coverage. They stated that Brinley's actions were intentional and malicious acts outside the scope of standard board duties. That meant the residents of Shady Oaks were personally on the hook for the $200,000 I was suing them for. Word leaked out instantly. My tenants, the Millers, texted me a video 3 days later. It showed a mob of angry homeowners marching down Maplewood Drive, converging on Brinley's pristine, aggressively manicured front lawn. An emergency recall election was held in the street. I stood at the edge of my uncle's county land, safely behind the willow trees, watching through the gaps in the foliage. It was glorious. Richard the accountant and Susan the tanner completely turned on her, throwing Brinley under the bus to save themselves from liability. The homeowners unanimously voted to dissolve the current board, immediately revoke the lien on my house, and nullify every single fine in my file. But it didn't end there for Brinley. The new, hastily elected board, led by a very sensible retired school teacher named Martha, discovered Brinley's unauthorized use of the $30,000 emergency roofing fund. They threatened to press criminal embezzlement charges unless she repaid the money immediately, facing financial ruin, public humiliation, and potential jail time. Brinley cracked. She put her house on the market a week later because she needed the cash immediately to avoid the embezzlement charges and settle the legal fees she had racked up. She had to accept an absolute lowball offer from a cash buyer. The day she moved out was a neighborhood holiday. I sat on the folding deck of my tiny home, sipping a celebratory beer. As the moving truck pulled away, Brinley drove her white golf cart up a ramp into the back of a trailer, refusing to look at anyone. She looked 10 years older, her posture defeated, her aura of absolute authority completely shattered. I agreed to drop my $200,000 lawsuit against the HOA under 3 conditions. First, they formally recognize the legal boundaries of my uncle's county land. Second, they pay my attorney and surveyor fees. And third, they leave me and my tiny home the hell alone for the rest of eternity. The new board eagerly agreed and signed a legally binding settlement that effectively firewalled my property from any future HOA interference. The Millers decided to renew their lease on the main house. They felt incredibly safe knowing the tyrant of Shady Oaks had been dethroned. We ended up taking down the small wooden fence that originally divided the yard, opening up a beautiful shared space that flowed right into the county woods. Life returned to the peaceful, quiet existence I had originally dreamed of. I spent my days writing code with a view of the creek, and my evenings watching the stars through my sleeping loft skylight. I never had to worry about aggressive knocks on the door, unhinged fines taped to my siding, or golf carts tearing up the grass. Sometimes when I walk the perimeter of my tiny home, I make sure to step right up to the invisible line that Thomas Gable had staked out. I look at the pristine, rule-bound world of Shady Oaks, and then I step back into the wild, unincorporated dirt of my own private kingdom. It cost Brinley Green her home, her reputation, and her power just to learn a very simple lesson. Before you try to destroy someone's life over a few feet of grass, you had better make absolutely sure you actually own the dirt they are standing on. If you enjoyed watching a tyrannical HOA president get a massive dose of instant karma, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever dealt with a crazy neighborhood committee? Let me know your worst HOA horror stories in the comments below. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss out on more incredible true stories of sweet revenge and real-life drama. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.